Good evening and welcome. I'm Megan Rust, Educator for Public Programs at the Frisch Center, and I'd like to thank you for joining us this evening. We are privileged to have Sam Moorhead, Finds Advisor for Iron Age and Roman Coins at the British Museum, here with us this evening to present The Reach of Rome, Then and Now, in honor of the opening of Rome, City and Empire. If you haven't had a chance to see this wonderful exhibition, we are open until 9 p.m. this evening, so we encourage you to head to the galleries afterwards and see all the beautiful works from the British Museum. The presentation of this exhibition is a collaboration between the British Museum and the Frisch Center. In addition to Dr. Moorhead, we are honored to have several distinguished guests with us this evening: Leslie Fitton, Keeper of Greece and Rome at the British Museum, and Emma Kelly, Head of International Touring Exhibitions. Join me in welcoming them. We would like to thank the following sponsors of Rome, City, and Empire in the Ingram Gallery. Our platinum sponsor, the HCA Foundation on behalf of HCA TriStar Health, and our hospitality sponsor, Union Station Hotel. This exhibition is supported in part by our 2018 Frisch Gala patrons and is also supported in part by an indemnity from the Federal Council on the Arts and the Humanities. And as always, we appreciate the continuing operating support from the Metro Nashville Arts Commission, the Tennessee Arts Commission, and the National Endowment for the Arts. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Sam Moorhead. Dr. Moorhead was awarded a scholarship to read classical archaeology and ancient history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Here, he published his first book and has written numerous articles on Roman coin hoards and site finds ever since. For many years, he taught archaeology and ancient history before joining the museum as a staff lecturer in archaeology. As head curator of interpretation, he worked on some major exhibitions such as Mummy, The Inside Story, Michelangelo, and Persia, the latter involving work in Iran. He is currently National Finds Advisor for Iron Age and Roman coins with the Portable Antiquities Scheme at the British Museum and oversees coin finds made across England and Wales. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sam Moorhead.
Thank you, Megan. Don't believe a word of it. It's excellent to be in Nashville. I'd like to say thank you to all the wonderful staff at the Frisch who have treated us like kings while we've been here, and I'm sure I speak for my two colleagues, Leslie and Emma, who are in the back. It's been a wonderful time, and I just have to say that the show has been put on so well by Mark and his team of designers, lighting experts, interpreters, educators. I'm not going into what I said on Wednesday, but it sings in a way that it never sings in the British Museum because we just don't have the space. We're not able to give all the individual objects the treatment that you've given them. So thank you so much to the Frisch for doing that for us. And also, I don't want to embarrass him, but I have been to Nashville before. It was actually 37 years ago when I was at university. And the person who brought me here is in the audience today. Thank you, Woody. But could I just remind you, Woody, what happens in the fraternity stays in the fraternity. Now, so I'm going to try and give you a whistle-stop tour of the Roman Empire, what it might mean then, what it might mean today. And if I ramble in any direction, you're welcome to call me to order. But I hope it will give an insight into how this show is trying to give you an idea of what it was like to be in the Roman Empire, but not just in Rome, anywhere in the empire. And so I shall try to give you some sort of background. The show is much more important than anything I will say, though. Now, the Roman Empire stretched from Scotland, and this is the Antonine Wall built against the Caledonians, who were always a thorn in the ribs for the Romans. The Romans never fully conquered Scotland, so any of you with Scottish ancestry can be proud of that. From Scotland all the way to Syria. This is a slightly more poignant image. It's an image I took in March 2011 of the theatre at Palmyra. And sadly, this part now no longer exists. And then we come back all the way to Morocco. Now, if Scotland is on the latitude of Nova Scotia, Morocco is on the latitude of Florida. So that's giving you an idea of the climatic change. And this is the southernmost city in the Roman Empire at Sala Colonia. And then we go all the way up again to Germany, to one of the largest amphitheatres for gladiatorial games in the Roman Empire at Trier. I'm sure many of you have been to many of these places, so I don't want to teach grandmothers to suck eggs, but I'm just giving you that extent. It's an empire of almost 2 million square miles. It's comparable to the United States, except the geography is totally different. Your geography is quite conveniently rectangular, with a few exceptions, whereas the Roman Empire is around the Mediterranean, 3 different continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe. It's a much more complex geographical configuration. It covers over 50 modern countries, and you have 50 states, don't you? So, well, okay, when we finally give up in Britain, we'll have 51. And then about 100 million people. Now, population estimates, archaeologists make up most of what they tell you anyway, but population estimates are desperately difficult. And one thing that's happening now with archaeology is remote sensing, LiDAR, for example, and I don't know how many of you have seen the recent work in Guatemala, where they have opened up an entire Mayan landscape we never knew existed. We are, in my scheme of what work I do at the British Museum, with recording finds made by metal detectorists, also identifying hundreds, if not thousands, of new Roman sites we never knew existed. And this means the population estimates are going to rise. And I think if I was to stand here in 10 years' time, that figure would be much higher. But it's only a rough idea of the numbers. And the various people here I show you are all in the exhibition, and they range from people who come from Spain, Syria, Italy, Germany, Algeria, sub-Saharan Africa, Libya, and Turkey. So that's just a snapshot of the places that you will see. And of course, Rome started on the 7 hills. This model from a display in Rome itself shows you the Palatine Hill with a few little huts. And in fact, the way that archaeologists reconstruct those huts is from the post holes that are found, but nothing else is found. So what do they use? They use the cinerary urn, the funerary urn, which you will see in the first or the second room of the exhibition, which is when you cremated someone, you would put their bones inside this urn and bury it. And I should remind you that ancient cremation, they couldn't reach the temperature that you can today. So you have a lot of bone. You can actually often sex or age the person, even from a cremation. So they went in here and into the ground. So this is the evidence we use for what those huts looked like all those years ago in the 8th century BC. And of course, the story of Rome starts by the time that they created the full mythology, the full legend, with Romulus and Remus, suckling the wolf here. And of course, then Remus ploughs the furrow for the city boundary. Romulus does. Remus jumps over it. Romulus kills him. The city is founded, and that is the start of Rome. But before Rome becomes a republic, it is a monarchy ruled by the Etruscans, people from the north. The Etruscans already had a lot of close links with the Greeks in the south of Italy, and so much of the Greek mythology is already coming into their world. And so this wonderful toilet box here has the scene of Persephone and Hades, the story of Persephone, Demeter, and Hades, 6 years in the underworld, 6 years living above. And this bronze mirror of the Etruscans has a scene with which you are all perfectly familiar, because you have it just down the road, the birth of Athena. So I don't need to teach anyone in Nashville about the birth of Athena. And in fact, Leslie who I should tell you, Leslie Fitton is the keeper of Greek and Roman, so she is one of the higher echelons of the British Museum, unlike me, who scrabbles around lower down. And we went there yesterday, and we both thought that the new painted Athena is marvellous, absolutely wonderful. And we are going to have an image of her, if we're allowed under copyright reasons, in our gallery as soon as possible. But there is the birth of Athena. As you know the story, Zeus had a headache, and out came Athena. In Rome itself, the Roman Forum, we have the heart of the republican system that developed after they ejected the Etruscans, the Senate. And the Senate consisted of 300 or more of the wealthiest people of Rome, the aristocratic classes, and from them were elected the magistrates, the 2 consuls, the 2 praetors, the quaestors, and a whole range of other magistrates, even people who were responsible for the aqueducts or the sewers, people responsible for striking the coins. This is where the Senate sat. Although this is a reconstructed building in the late Roman period after a fire, it's interesting, because it doesn't have the grandeur of the other Roman buildings. And I believe this is because what was important in the Senate was what the people were doing inside. Most of the grand buildings you see in Rome are temples, and you didn't go inside a temple, it was to be seen from outside. And this is quite a contrast to another famous Senate, which you all know about, where the capital, and in fact, I know this sounds ridiculous, but my grandfather had a rather nice house in England before the Second World War, and when he went to the war, I'm afraid he lost everything in the war, and the house had to be sold. But it was designed by the same architect as the Capitol. It's the only 1 or 2 buildings in Britain by the same architect. But this, I always think, looks rather like a wedding cake. But it is obviously classically inspired, and the word Senate comes into your world, obviously. And it gets even closer. The little bronze statuette here, which you will see in the second room, is a lictor. He's a junior magistrate, so he would walk in front of the consuls, and he held the fasces. Now, this has bent, I'm afraid, at the top, but it would be straight. And it is actually the rods and the axe, which appears on the back of your dimes in the last century. And these are the symbols of authority, the authority to beat with rods, to punish, or if people have been especially naughty, to execute. And this symbol has been used throughout history. And I was told by one of the wonderful docents you have here that George Washington had, his table legs were made of the fasces. And on that topic, you may not know this, but your founding fathers were steeped in the classics, so I'm sure you know this, much more than people might be aware of. This, when I was at UNC, I can remember I was up in their sort of general meeting area, and the professors were all fingering a photocopy, and they were all going, oh, this is the original syllabus at the University of North Carolina. And I then emailed about a month or so ago the classics department saying, could you send me a copy? I didn't realise I was going to cause the biggest amount of chaos in the archives at the university. And the emails coming back, we don't know what you're talking about, where is it, what is it? They found it. This is it. It's actually 1823. Now, as you know, North Carolina is the oldest state university in the country, and it's 1780s, but this is early enough. And if I go on to the next here, you will see at the start of all the syllabi, you have Cornelius Nepos, Sallust, Roman Antiquities, Virgil, Cicero, and then you get the lesser subjects afterwards, like elements of ancient and modern geography or arithmetic, algebra, and then right down the bottom, English. So the classics were at the top of the list. That is what you did when you were an undergraduate in Old West, the first hall of residence at the university. Now, Italy itself, the Rome is here. This is Etruscan territory. These are the Sabines and the Samnites and the Greeks in the south. And it took the Romans about 300 years of expansion to actually gain Italy. It was some bloody wars. And once they gained Italy, they then made Sicily their first province. But they were to meet a very veritable foe in the form of the Carthaginians, who were Punic people who originally came from Lebanon and Syria on the coastline. So they were Eastern in origin. And the Carthaginians were to prove a real thorn in the ribs for the Romans for about 100 years. They fought 3 major wars against them. And the elder Cato, whenever he stood up in the Senate and said something, he always ended his speeches with, Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. And in the end, he got his own way, although he died by then. In 146, it was finally destroyed. This coin, which is on display, is one of the finest coins of its type in existence. And in fact, prizing this out of the hands of the curator responsible for it was an interesting experience. But you see one of Hannibal's elephants as he took over the Alps before he defeated the Romans in several battles. But it became a war of attrition, and that's why he lost. But when you go to Carthage, you see that these are the Punic houses. The Romans built above them, they destroyed them, and they built an enormous substructure above for their buildings much higher. And this really is how you show the enemy who's in charge. But what is more interesting, though, contrary to the belief of what the general texts tell us, Punic culture continued. And you will see in the gallery a Punic stela, a funerary monument, and the bust of a lady who's African, who are the survivors of the Punic culture who still keep their cultural traits in the Roman period. So even though they were defeated, they did remain as an independent culture. The Eastern Mediterranean was conquered when Mark Antony and Cleopatra were defeated at the Battle of Actium, and you will see the general who did that, Agrippa, the right-hand man, the henchman, the fixer of Augustus. And here Cleopatra is dying in a highly imaginative painting. This is Mark Antony, who is in the exhibition. It's a tiny little ring. I apologize for a small ring, but there are very few busts of Mark Antony in existence. We don't have one at the British Museum. If you do have one in your collection at home, do let us have it. But I'm afraid we have to use other objects. But this ring is indicative of the rings worn by the followers of these late Republican leaders like Caesar, Crassus, Pompey, Lepidus, the men who started to turn the Republic upside down. And they had all their followers. And we have a ring at the museum of a follower of Caesar. So it was your way of showing loyalty to these people who basically were populist leaders who usurped and broke the rules and in the end brought the Republic crashing down. Caesar, meanwhile, is conquering northern Europe. This is Caesar here, and he's wearing a golden laurel wreath, which served 2 purposes. It showed that he was a victorious general, defeating Gaul, but also it covered a bald patch, which he was very embarrassed about. And on the inscription, it says he's dictator perpetuo, dictator for life. This is one of the reasons why he was to be assassinated, and we'll come to that in a minute. But on another one of his coins, in great contrast, it shows the Gallic leader, Vercingetorix, who led the rebellion against the Romans. And he's shown very much as the noble barbarian. And any of you who've got Scottish or Irish or Welsh ancestry, and you like to see yourself as Celtic, if you want to be authentic Celtic, you lime wash your hair in spikes, like a punk rocker. That is the authentic lime wash hair of a northern European. And at this time, when Caesar was in Gaul, he made 2 preliminary expeditions to Britain. And he arrived literally at this very point, the White Cliffs, with his ships. My ancestors were standing all the way along the cliffs. And he decided to sail around the edge until he could get onto a beach. And he did manage to land. But the problem that Caesar had when he arrived was his cavalry got swept away by the tides. He had no cavalry. And we in Britain were a bit backward then. We had a form of warfare that had gone out of use. It was very much the warfare of the Trojan War, the chariot warfare. And here, on the other side of the coin I've just shown you, it shows two British charioteers. And they employed a hit-and-run tactic. The charioteer would drive the chariot up to the Roman legions. The British warrior, who would be a very high-status man indeed, would get off. He'd clobber a couple of Romans and then get on the chariot and ride off again. And this hit-and-run tactic confused the Roman army enormously, and it took them a long time to adjust to it. But it is actually, funnily enough, in a British tradition, because those of you who know Lawrence of Arabia, he adapted this policy of hit-and-run insurgency tactics in the Arab Revolt in 1917 in the Jordanian desert. And then in the Second World War, the Special Air Service, the SAS, our special troops, adopted exactly the same policy in the northern desert in Africa with the 8th Army. And of course, your special services play the same game as well. So this idea of hit-and-run warfare being used is not something which died out with the chariot of the Britons. I'd like to think it's a tradition that still exists. But coming back to Caesar, this is the most famous Roman coin ever struck. It's very rare. There are only about 30 of them in existence, and I'm pleased to say the British Museum's got 4. It shows you 2 daggers. The cap of liberty in the middle. When you were a slave and you were given your freedom, you were given the Pileus, the cap of liberty. And of course, this is used in the French Revolution. The absolute archetypal, iconic image of the French Revolution is the cap of liberty. And then below the giveaway is Ide Mar, the Ides of March. So this is a coin struck by Brutus, who with Cassius were the ringleaders in the assassination of Caesar. And it's a very potent piece. In the Roman world, you were not supposed to celebrate publicly the killing of a fellow Roman. It was a taboo topic. And in fact, it didn't happen again until the reign of Constantine the Great, 300 years later. But here Brutus is celebrating the killing of Caesar and claiming that he's bringing liberty to the Roman world. Well, alas, alack, it didn't work like that. Brutus and Cassius themselves were both killed at the Battle of Philippi, and I have a suspicion that these coins were generally withdrawn from circulation as fast as possible. It led the way for Octavian, who defeated Antony and Cleopatra, to become the first emperor. And what he did was he cleverly created this veneer of the old republic remaining. The consuls remained, the Senate remained, all the other magistracies remained, but what effectively happened within a few decades is the emperor gained control of everything. And now we have an imperial world rather than a republican one. And this bust of Octavian is interesting. This is made around about the time of the Battle of Actium as a youthful man. But when he dies at 77, about 30 years later, 35 years later or so, the busts have pretty well the same look. He never gets older than 30. And to say the cult of the youth is a new thing, it's not at all. The other thing is, whether he looked like this or not is a moot point, because this is highly stylized upon the earlier busts of Alexander the Great. And when you go into the gallery, you'll see him next to Agrippa. And here is the wonderful, clean-shaven, very almost boy-like, godlike Octavian. And next to him, you'll see the rugged, rather fearsome-looking Agrippa, his right-hand man, in contrast, who I'll show you in a second. But when Augustus came to the throne, the court poets just take off. Virgil, Ovid, Horace, all those people who those of you who studied Latin at school will remember. And today you get political soundbites. And political soundbites in Britain are so sophisticated now. We have one which is, Brexit means Brexit. Haven't the first idea what that is. And I won't say what the soundbites are out here, but they're 2 words, one begin with F and one begin with N. You can work it out. But this here is what a soundbite should be. Forget not Roman, that it is your special genius to rule the peoples, to impose the ways of peace, to spare the defeated, and to crush those who will not defeat. Well, that's a fairly potent statement, and it sums up Romanitas in pretty well one sentence. Rome brought the Pax Romana, but the deal was that you would have the benefits of the Pax Romana if you submitted. If you did not submit, you will be beaten up until you did submit. Empires are brutal by their very nature, and this barbarian here has been on the receiving end of that brutality. And he's actually seated with his arms tied behind his back, with his beard showing him as being a rugged, uncouth, uncivilized man, with a hat which is an Eastern barbarian hat. He's an archetypal generic barbarian, and he's seated at the skirts, you can't see the big statue, it no longer exists, of victory. So that is how they depicted the vanquished foe. And they went on vanquishing more people in the imperial period. So I'm afraid my poor country, Britannia, is conquered in 43, and here is Claudius vanquishing, smiting Britannia herself. I couldn't bring this to you, it's actually in Turkey at Aphrodisias. But you have got this, which is a little coin. He built a triumphal arch in Rome, De Britannia, the conquest of Britain, about the conquest of Britain. And on top is Claudius on horseback with two trophies on either side. And in Britain, we were to be the most one of the most troublesome provinces. There are two. I'll come to the other one in a minute. We were always causing problems for the Romans. To win a conquest in Britain was to win the greatest triumph you could in Rome. So there were emperors who actually picked a fight in Britain so they could say they'd beaten the Britons, and the Scots even more so. And Hadrian here is to build this wall when they decide that actually it's not worth conquering Scotland. It's too much of a problem. And here you see Hadrian's wall, and we were all discussing in England only a few years ago when they had the independence vote in Scotland, whether we'd have to rebuild it again. But Hadrian also was the first person to put Britannia on a coin. And here is the coin with Britannia seated like a warlike Minerva. And she's seated on rugged rocks. Britain was seen as a rugged, rocky terrain with lots of dark woods and swamps and bogs. That's how they depicted us. And Britannia then, in the reign of Charles II, in 1660s, comes back on the British coins. And here she is over here. And I thought I'd choose to you a very poignant coin with Britannia on, just to see if you regret or not. Because this is Britannia on the back of a halfpenny of that famous king, King George III. And the date is 1775. Do you wish you had a time machine? I don't know. The other troublesome province was Judea. And in Judea, the Jewish religion, obviously very much its own cultural entity, did not like having to worship the emperor. And there were all sorts of other Judaic practices which were very typical to them, which the Romans objected to. Circumcision being one of them, for example. And this led to two great revolts. The first great revolt was in 66 to 73. And this is when the Emperor Titus crushed it. There was a bust of Titus in the exhibition, but this coin also, with Titus standing under a palm tree and dejected Judea seated underneath, again showing the vanquished enemy. But those of you who've been to Israel, I don't know how many of you have, there's some wonderful sites there. And I was lucky enough to excavate in Israel for 5 years of my life. But this is the siege ramp that the Romans built up to Masada. You get an idea of the scale. This is Roman engineering for you. This is what empires do. It says great empires are not upheld by being timid. And this is where the final zealots and Judeans were taken. Most of them committed suicide before they were captured by the Romans. I think only a few women and children actually survived. And after this, the treasures from the temple in Jerusalem were brought to Rome, including the gold menorah. And we know from other sources they survived in the Roman treasury for a great deal of time. But they're depicted here on the Arch of Titus in Rome, which you can still see today. So here is the very visible statement that Titus is making: I have conquered Judea. Trajan goes one further. The Emperor Trajan from Spain, a Roman family from Spain, is really seen as the second Alexander the Great. And he conquers the Dacians, modern Romania, north of the Danube. And his conquest is celebrated by Trajan's Column in Rome, which I'm sure any of you who've been to Rome will have seen it. We couldn't bring the column to you, obviously. But next best thing, you will see in the gallery a print, which is about that size, maybe a bit bigger even, 4 meters tall, of Trajan's Column. And Trajan's Column shows the victory over the campaigns over the Dacians for almost 200 meters of it, going spiraling round. And this particular print by Piranezi caused us a great deal of headache. It took us 3 attempts to get it framed correctly so it could travel all the way to America. And it's the first time that any member of the public has seen this print. So you are the first. No one in Britain's ever seen it before. And of course, the idea of columns has caught on in modern society. So in Trafalgar Square, obviously, we have a column with Nelson on the top. This is, again, another almost certainly copied from the Roman tradition. What do the Roman army do? Well, the first thing they do is they build roads. And this photograph is taken by Bob Bewley, one of the preeminent aerial photographers in the Roman world. He's been working in Jordan for about 30 years now. And this, you can see the road, the Via Nova Traiana, going all the way up. It starts down here in the Red Sea at Aqaba, and it goes all the way up through the Jordanian desert, up to the Haran, into Syria, through Damascus, and out to the Euphrates. And this is the road going through Damascus. I took that photograph in March 2011, just before the Civil War broke out. I don't know what it looks like now. We'll see, I hope, when peace finally is restored, whenever that might be. The Roman army also built forts. The analogy we could use is when you all pressed westwards across the states and your cavalry built their various forts to hold territory. This is exactly what the Romans did. And the Kaiser, the German Kaiser Wilhelm, in the early 19th century, rebuilt one of these Roman forts in Germany, at Zalberg, and you can see what these forts are like. And the great thing about these for the Romans was they were little pockets of Romanization. And so the soldiers there would start to influence the local culture. They would often marry into local families. And around the outside of the forts, you get shanty towns that then became more solid, of traders, local people living there. And so you'd have a whole little mini Rome. And these forts all over the northwestern part of the empire were the way that they Romanized the local population. And the most important thing that the Roman army brought was money. You and I go to a cash machine, or we go to the bank to get our money. In those days, you had to wait until the Roman army or officials spent their money on goods and services that you were providing to get money. So the Roman army were crucial for the source of money. And I know this from Britain, the work I do, we can tell you when the Roman army move on, the coins cease to be found. They are the conduit for loot and money. And the one thing that if you were a provincial soldier, the Roman army was made up of 30 legions and they were Roman citizens. But they then had numerous provincial units who were normally cavalrymen, archers, even slingers from the Balearic Islands in the Mediterranean. And these specialist units of provincial troops, they were after one thing at the end, and that was Roman citizenship. And citizenship today is a big issue. In Europe, we're all discussing about the rights of Europeans living in Britain now after Brexit. I know you're having discussions in the United States about who should and shouldn't be citizens. It's been an age-old problem. And this tablet records that a man called Gemellus, who's been serving in the Hungarian cavalry in Britain, after 25 years he gets his citizenship. And what does he do? He's had enough of being in Britain. He goes straight back home to the Danube, and he dies in Brigetio, and that's where this discharged tablet is found. But because of this tablet, his children become citizens. He has financial, fiscal, judicial, and legal rights beyond those of the provincials, the class that he used to be. Now, if we come to Rome and the empires, the urban centres themselves, this wonderful picture, and I've actually credited the person who took the photograph, because what happened is we've given our photographs to the British Museum, so they're all copyright, but David Stuttard, who's a co-author with me of several books, took this wonderful photograph of Rome, which graces your entry gallery. And this is what we think of when we think of Rome, really. We think of the grandeur of the city. And they went on celebrating their victories in the city. So you have triumphal arches like this one that Septimius Severus built to show his defeat of the Parthians in the east. And of course, the Arc de Triomphe in Paris is just the more recent part of this tradition. Roman religion is absolutely at the heart of everything they do. Basically, in Roman religion, you have to honour the gods through sacrifice, the bull being the most important animal of sacrifice, and if you honour the gods through sacrifice, they in turn should honour you back with blessing. It's a contract, very different from Christianity. And what is interesting is that the chief priest in the Roman world was called the Pontifex Maximus. Often it was the emperor or another leading aristocrat in Rome. And here I show you Agrippa. This is the bust you will see of Agrippa in the gallery. He's actually dressed, shown with his toga over his head, because he's in a priestly role of sacrifice. He was never actually the Pontifex Maximus. But this title is inherited immediately by the popes. So the popes now are the Pontifex Maximus. This is tradition coming up to today, continuing all the way through from 2,500 years ago. The various religions we have, the traditional religions of the Olympian gods, shown here by Diana. You'll see all of those traditional Greco-Roman gods in the... Also, we have the priestesses. And in fact, this priestess is shown with the features of the Empress Livia, the wife of Augustus. And she herself was a very interesting character. Livia, we are told, did not let Augustus near her bed. What sort of marriage it was, I don't know. Also, Livia was determined that her son from a previous marriage, Tiberius, became emperor. So Livia removed all the opposition. And by removed, I mean had them killed. Livia then decided she'd had enough of Augustus himself. So she poisoned his figs. And then she managed to convince Claudius to make her a goddess. So Livia was a pretty nifty character. And there are in the Roman world some very, very strong women, especially at the end of the Roman world when all the men are giving up. It's the women who hold the show together. And then finally, talking about the end of the Roman Empire, we have mystery cults coming in from the east. And this is Mithras slaying the bull. By slaying the bull in a cave, he brought life to the world and he brought light to the world. And this is showing this event, which the religion itself gave salvation, it gave afterlife, community. It even had a communion rather similar to Christianity. In the end of the Roman Empire, when things became more insecure, they turned to these mystery cults to have personal salvation rather than the older traditional, very impersonal Roman religion. But you could be made a god or a goddess. So one emperor, when his wife died very early in the reign, he made her an empress, and she is in the exhibition, Faustina, and he built her a temple in the Forum. So she has her own temple, which then is dedicated to him as a god when he dies. But when I came into the museum yesterday, I looked to the south, I think it's the south, and I saw this statue on top of the building, and it's Mercury. Here is Mercury in the exhibition from a silver statuette in the Masson Hall. And of course, Mercury was the god of thieves. But also, of course, he was the god of communications. And this is your train station, I'm told. So I apologize, I don't want to offend you, but even today, the Roman gods are used for their correct purpose. And in fact, I think one of your telecommunications company, not sure the Bell company, actually had Mercury on the logo. So he is the god of communications. Then we get to cleanliness and baths. Bathing in the Roman world was a big issue. And Caracalla here, who was one of the most unpleasant of all the Roman emperors, Edward Gibbon, the famous historian who wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, about the same time as you broke away from Britain in the 18th century, he actually said that Caracalla was the common enemy of mankind. But those in Rome wouldn't have had a word of it because he built them a bathhouse that was 24 acres large. And it could hold over 1,000 people at any one time in all sorts of baths. And you would go there not only to get clean and to exercise, but you would also go there to do business. So those of you in the room who are businessmen, you go to the local leisure centre here and have a swim. I don't know if you do business that way. That's how you did it in the Roman world. This was where everything happened. And you'd have women and men at different times as well. Mixed bathing was heavily frowned upon. And you have in the exhibition a strigil and an oil flask. The oil flask depicting a person from sub-Saharan Africa, so a black African who they used to call Ethiopians, that's the term. And you would use oil to clean yourself and scrape it off. I'm not going to go through the full bathing process, I'm sure you understand it. But in Algeria, at Kencella, there is a Roman bathhouse that is still used. And there they all are, the local population using the Roman baths at Kencella. Then you move on to the Colosseum, which is obviously the greatest monument in Rome, and 50,000 people could sit here at any one time for the games. And the objects we've shown you, one is a rather prosaic object. It's an altar to Hercules, a strong man, by a person who was in the trade of marble at the time the Colosseum was built. So you can imagine this man was making a lot of money out of providing marble for the Colosseum. But on the other side, we have what actually went on. So in the morning, you had the animal fights. You had wild beasts. There could be elephants, tigers, lions, leopards, you name it, they had them. And here we have a cautionary tale. And in the British Museum, we've always joked about this, that this is what happens when you take on a lion with a rolled-up newspaper. You lose. It's probably a club of some sort. But this is a fight. People got killed by these beasts. And then at lunchtime, you would have executions. And the most famous executioner that has actually come down in the record is a Caledonian bear from Scotland. And she was used as an executioner. You sent in the captive, and off she went, did her business. And she was so famous that when she got too old, they retired her off with a pension. And she lived happily in a park outside Rome for the rest of her life. But then in the afternoon, you had the real games, the gladiatorial combat. And you had all sorts of different gladiators. You've seen the film Gladiator. You have the heavily armed hoplomachus or secutors. Here we have a heavily armed gladiator. You had the lightly armed retiaris with his trident and net. But up here you have a real novelty. You have two women gladiators, Aquilia and Amazonia. And these were genuine. They existed. The Emperor Domitian was very fond of women gladiators. And these two, we're told on the inscription, have either been sent back to the barracks alive or they've been given their freedom altogether. And you will see in the gallery there was a discharge ticket giving a gladiator freedom. So this is the circenses of Juvenal's Panem et Circenses, bread and circuses. As long as the people in Rome have free grain, free bread, and free games, they're happy. And of course, this tradition of games still exists today. I have to say that touchdown that the quarterback scored, the cheeky little touchdown, was one of the most delicious moments of American football I've ever seen. It was very classy. It was a great Super Bowl. But someone afterwards might explain to me what's happening in this play here. But the idea of the arena around sport is a Roman one. The Greeks had their racetracks and the like, but the arena enclosing, which we all now have for football, basketball, soccer, this comes directly from the Romans. But also, they had their horse racing and their chariot racing. And this is the Circus Maximus. Just before I say, those are the Baths of Caracalla in the distance, massive. But this is the racecourse down here. And you can see the tiers coming up to the Palatine Hill. And the imperial box was up here. So the emperor would come out from his palace and you could watch everything below. And you had 300,000 people here, an enormous number. And I was trying to get an analogy. Racecourses in Britain don't really have very big stands. Okay, Epsom has fairly large stands, Aintree, but nothing great. And then luckily you helped me out because you have, obviously at Churchill Down, the Kentucky Derby. And actually, those stands are the closest I could find to what you would have had at the Circus Maximus. This enormous number of people close and watching. And in the Roman world, you had two teams in the end, the blues and the greens. And if you were a supporter of one or the other, when you were in the arena, you hated the other. And in the Byzantine period, they even became religious factions. Two different Christian factions who had two different beliefs about the Trinity and what the Trinity was. I don't think that happens today, except in Scotland we do have two football teams in Glasgow, Rangers and Celtic, and they are blues and greens. And also Celtic is very much the Catholic Scottish side, and Rangers are the Protestant Scottish side. So there are again some modern analogies. Hadrian was to build his Pantheon in Rome, which still has the largest freestanding dome of any building in the world. Michelangelo, when he built St. Peter's, made sure it was slightly smaller because he didn't want to outdo Hadrian. But probably what you don't know is that these columns in the front, which weigh about 60 tons, they came all the way from Egypt. Aswan, those who've been to Egypt on the first cataract, but others miles out in the eastern desert at Mons Claudianus. And one of my colleagues, Derek Wellesby at the British Museum, has worked there, and this is the column that never made it. 60-ton column. They required 300 donkeys to pull it across the desert. Now, I come from a farming background, and I know the problems of dealing with one donkey. But dealing with 300, it gives you an idea of the scale of organisation and administration required to build this structure in Rome. And Rome itself, which had at its height probably 1 million inhabitants, was consuming things like olive oil at vast quantity. This was found in the baths of Titus in Rome, and the potsherds were then stacked up on a hill, and there's an entirely man-made hill called Monte Testaccio of broken up wine and olive oil vessels. If I'm going over time, you've got to tell me, if we get to a private architecture and private houses. This is a reconstruction of, obviously, the house of the Vecchi at Pompeii. We have in the gallery various items from this. So houses like this, mosaics on the floor, which were ubiquitous throughout the Roman Empire, and then wall paintings. This one from Pompeii that survives because of the eruption of Vesuvius. And I had no idea when I chose this object that it would be coming to Nashville, because this is Apollo as god of music, which is highly appropriate. I suppose we should have put a Martin or a Gibson guitar in there instead. But there he is. And the Romans obviously loved their drink. This is the the amphora for 20 litres, the decanter here, the glass drinking horn, and the man drinking from it, and Bacchus, the god of wine, arriving at a party. He's already inebriated, being held up by one of his satyrs. The whole drinking tradition, and there are other objects you'll see there, very popular. But getting towards the end, that is Rome high culture, but what about the actual empire itself? As I've said to people many times, there's no such thing as Roman art. It's art in the Roman Empire, because it's so different. And to give you an idea of the reach of Roman art and Roman items, these are both pillar mold glass bowls made in Italy, probably in the same workshop. One is found in Bahrain, in the Gulf, and the other in England, just north of London. This shows you how things moved across the empire. And if we look at art in Britannia, it's very different. This isn't the monumental sculpture you've just been seeing. Someone has already said, is this a Tennessee walking horse? Seriously, a docent asked, well, it isn't but such, but it may well be in that tradition. You will see a horse in the gallery being trained by its rider, which may well be straight out of your tradition. But in Scotland, the Scots, as I told you, were never defeated. And when the Romans arrived, they brought a metal the Scots did not have, which is brass. And brass is copper and zinc. And you had brass coins and a lot of brass helmets and other equipment, military equipment. So what do the Scots do? They melt them down and they make these wonderful armbands. So that's their way of, basically, we say in England, flicking two fingers at the Romans. We're going to make your material into armbands. I'm going to show off our independence. But you have also this dragoness brooch. Both of them have enamelling. Enamelling in the Roman world is best in Britain. And this dragoness brooch, worn commonly by the Roman army, again, very different from what you would find in Rome itself. And then the ladies, you have these cosmetic sets. This is a pestle, a grinder, and the groove on top of this, where you would grind up carbon and other makeup to apply to you. And these are very, very popular, and they were hung around the neck on a string often, so they'd be for ready use. But having had all this rather British, almost barbarian art, you then get this man, Carausius, who's the Roman emperor, who declares independence in Britain. And he and his successor for 10 years managed to keep the Roman Empire away. So, as I say now, quite topically, he is the first Brexit. But what you don't expect is on his coins, for the first and only time in the Roman period, he starts quoting the poet Virgil. So here is expectate veni, welcome, O long-awaited one. And the return of the Golden Age is referred to here. So you have the outpost of empire in Britain, and yet they are quoting the most famous of the Roman poets on the coins. So you have to be very careful when you try to draw conclusions about the nature of different provinces. They could be more Roman than the Romans. And in Britain, we do something else. It's a curse. And this lady has lost some cloth. So she asked the god Mercury to curse the person who's stolen it. And it says here, man, woman, free or slave. They then say, may they not be able to sit down, stand up, walk, sleep until they return the material to me. And she promises the god a third of the value. I don't believe that they would have done this unless it worked. And so this is, again, a very personal item. If we go down to Africa, and I mentioned earlier, this is where we have the art which is so different from what you see in Rome. A Roman concept, this funeral gravestone, but the actual style is very local, as is this lady here. She's almost certainly a black African from Algeria, and you can see the style of her hair is so totally different. But the concept is Roman, the style is African. And this is what I mean by art in the Roman world. It's the fusion of the two. And in Egypt, it gets even better. Why have we put this object in an exhibition on the Roman Empire? Because that is the Emperor Tiberius honouring the Theban gods. He became a pharaoh in Egypt, just like the Greek kings after Alexander the Great did. And Horus on the other side is shown as a Roman rather than an Egyptian. He's wearing a Roman tunic with scale armour. And in Egypt, in the desert, is found the papyrus you will see, which is a census. And this is what's often missing from the Roman records, is it'd be like today if all the emails suddenly got scrubbed across the world for the last 10 years. Archivists would have nothing to go on, really. Who writes letters anymore? Well, in those days, papyrus doesn't survive at all well, nor does parchment, nor do the wooden writing tablets we have in Britain, unless you have very hot climate for papyrus or waterlogged conditions that stop bacteria eating the wood in Britain. And then you find a myriad of these objects which give us information about daily life. And in fact, the British one here, and sadly we couldn't bring them over because they are too delicate to travel. They're not allowed to even travel out of the museum. This is two centurions talking to each other, and one saying to the other, saying, look, please, will you get me the money? Because if you don't get me the 500 denarii for that corn, I'm going to lose my deposit. And then he says, I can't deliver you the leather which is down at another fort because the roads are so bad. And so you get this insight into life at that level, people having to wheel and deal, people having to transport items, which you don't normally see when you look at the more impressive works of art. And finally, for the provinces, we go to the east, where you have some wonderful cities like Apamea here. This is a photograph again taken just before the Syrian civil war started, the longest high street in the Roman Empire. And through here would have come items like gold, emeralds from India, garnets from India. You would have had pepper from India, silks from China. And it's shown on this coin here of Arabia with her camel, alluding to these caravans that arrive. And of course, most of them come through Palmyra. And you will see some Palmyrene heads next door, funerary busts, this lady and a man in their finery with their silks and their jewellery. And when 20 years ago I commissioned at the museum these costumes of two Palmyrene ladies, and these are designed by the man and made by one of the people who did the costumes for the I, Claudius series, some of you might remember, Roger Oldhamstead. And he used the colours of silk found in the tombs in Palmyra. And this is something you have to remember again. We missed the colour. These would have been painted. You can still see some paint just up here. The colour and the vibrancy, which is what we lose. Most of the marble sculpture you will see next door was painted. So that's something else to remember. And Pliny tells us that at the lowest reckoning, India, China, and the Arabian Peninsula take from our empire 100 million sesterces, that's about $1,000 million every year. This is the amount our luxuries and our ladies cost. So this is the silk. Don't worry, ladies, you can get your own back. Try the figs trick. And this is one of the coins that was exported to India to pay for it, and the Indians used to put slashes through the head, probably so it couldn't go back to the Roman world and be used as money, because you didn't deface the emperor's portrait. And we end up the exhibition with In Memoriam, and Marcus Aurelius said, soon you will be forgotten, the world will have forgotten, soon you will have forgotten the world, and the world will have forgotten you. That's a very cheerful statement. Discuss, because the Romans actually commemorated people in all sorts of ways. So you could have a casket like this, which contains the cremated remains of three people, a man, his wife, and his daughter. Very personal, and the inscription in both Latin and Greek. Or you could be even less well off, and you would just have a glass cinerary urn to put the ashes in, as in this British piece. Or in the late Roman Empire, you could have a highly ornate sarcophagus carved with the wedding of Ariadne and Bacchus in all its full riot, which is a symbolism for eternal life and life after death. Bacchus, Dionysus, giving you another life. So you had all these various ways of commemorating the dead. And in Egypt, you have these mummy portraits, and this one's next door. Lovely painted portrait on the mummy. And we know from work on another mummy that actually they're idealized. This isn't really what the people look like, because this and many others are based on imperial portraits of the time. And you can see in the next door gallery the portrait that this one is based upon. It's based upon Faustina II, the daughter of Antoninus Pius, the wife of Marcus Aurelius, the mother of Commodus, who is the emperor in the opening gallery. And she also is looking through the gallery, probably for the first time ever, at her mother, who is the massive statue head of Faustina in the corner of the other gallery. So she is linked all the way across the galleries. But this is what you did. You copied the imperial hairstyles. And my favorite story about memorials is this man here, Gaius Cestius, builds himself a pyramid in Rome. And it's likely, given the dates here, that he was on a campaign that went south of Aswan into Sudan. And because this pyramid is in the style with steep sides of the pyramids of Sudan, not Egypt. And here they are at Jebel Barkal. So he's probably copying a Sudanese monument back in Rome. The end of Rome comes with Christianity. Constantine here gazing towards heaven. In the catacombs, you would have a funeral feast when you buried your relatives. You would smash your glasses, and the base of the glass, which had a gold leaf design, in this case the Saints Peter and Paul, would then be mortared in next to your relative forever after as a marker. And that's why we have some of these in the catacombs. And the churches that were built weren't designed upon temples, they were designed upon the Roman law courts and town halls, the basilica. And that's where the basilican churches come from. This is St. Paul's outside the wall that was built originally in the 320s. But Rome at this time was incredibly wealthy. And this is a horse trapping in silver with gold gilt, used by the aristocratic senatorial classes in their great processions through the Roman Forum into the Circus Maximus at the very end. And they were carrying out these wonderful parades and processions right up to the time that the Goths came to siege Rome. And when the Goths came to siege Rome, much of the silver was buried, and that came from a hoard of silver found in Rome that was probably buried at the time of the sack of Rome in 410. But we finish up at the end, you've been very patient, with the Venerable Bede, who's a monk, in fact, near Newcastle, up in north of England, who wrote several centuries later, "As long as the Colosseum stands, so long stands Rome. But when it falls, then Rome falls, and with it the whole world." So we need to make sure that the Colosseum remains standing. But there are some people who try to keep the Roman world going. And this is the centenary of the Roman Society, which has an enormous number of American members as well. We've actually had our conferences in America, at Ann Arbor recently. And this shows you the staff of the British Museum dressed as Romans to celebrate the 100th anniversary. The deputy director, who was the president, Andrew Burnett, dressed as the Emperor Vespasian, flanked by Bethany Hughes, who's a major media star on the ancient world in Britain, and Mary Beard, who you might be reading her book SPQR, the Professor of Classics at Cambridge University. And she, I'm afraid, is blocking Leslie Fitton, who is in the back of the room, who is behind her. I am an honorary slave in this organisation, so I don't feature in this photograph. But the Roman Society promotes the teaching of Latin in schools across Britain, and we give out grants to them, and is one of many societies that keeps the Roman world living. But of course, the population as a whole, people as a whole, are more interested in the entertainment that Rome provides. So films like Gladiator, and I can remember Leslie and I and all our other colleagues went to the premiere of this in London. It's the most amazing movie. It mangles the history, yes, but it's still an amazing film. And of course, Joachim Phoenix doesn't have a beard here. That is what he should have had. Anyway, so I end with Marcus Aurelius, and he says, look closely at the past and its changing empires, and it's possible to foresee the things to come. Well, it's a rather trite statement, but I think it's true. And if, when you go around the show, if you take away just one thought about the past, which might inform about the future, I'll be happy. Because I do think that the Roman world has so much that underpins our world, and it's still relevant today. And I think at a time in the world when we are all undergoing phenomenal change, and none of us know what life is going to be like in 10 years, that looking back at empires like Rome that had to deal with change all the way through as well, it's actually quite useful to know that even though Rome did fall, her traditions and all her various cultural influences have continued down the years with us today. So we may change, but things won't be all that bad, I promise you. Good night.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you all for coming. Please see Rome, City, and Empire on view now in our Ingram galleries. Thank you.